Well, good evening, everyone. We will give one more second for people to log on to tonight's webinar, which is on the radiologist side hustle with our wonderful guest speaker, Dr. Andrew Smith. And we will go over in a few minutes what the AUR webinar series is all about from this grant. We'll give everyone just a minute or two. All right, it looks like we've got people joining. So why don't we go ahead and just remind people who may have attended this webinar series and inform those who may not have what exactly this webinar series is all about. So really this was born out of a desire to help mid-career faculty to establish what it was they needed in terms of skills and to provide them with some exposure to skills that maybe they didn't have or that they need to learn more about. And so with the funding from the A&E research grant, from the venture grant, we managed to put together this webinar series. And the purpose really was to develop and implement the curriculum for career development, which was targeting the mid-career faculty, because we know that there's a dearth of material out there for this group. This series consists of the webinar, which you are all kindly attending tonight, and this is open to all AUR members. We're also putting together a reading list of books and articles that we think are germane to mid-career faculty development to help you all move to those next career ladders. And we're curating some YouTube videos on productivity topics to help you be more focused and successful in balancing your work and getting to those academic topics that you need to try and move on with your career development. I encourage everyone, we still have some slots available for our small group component of this. This is a competitive application project, a process where it involves a group Coursera course that we're going to work on together, as well as research and writing mentorship, some CV analysis, gap analysis, mentorship and guidance on filling in those gaps through group peer activities, and a virtual journal club. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Dr. Smith, who has a long list of accomplishments, so I'm only going to name a few. He is the Vice Chair of Clinical Research and Professor of Abdominal Imaging at the University of Alabama, Birmingham. He has an MD, PhD in molecular and cellular biology from the Medical College of Ohio, and he is a clinical scientist, inventor, and entrepreneur who has founded a number of companies, including Radiologist LLC, which is a core imaging lab. And with that, I'm going to invite him to share his slides and give us his presentation.
Thanks, Dr. Catanzano. I appreciate it. I'll get started here and share some slides. Okay, so yeah, we're going to talk about the radiologist side hustle. It's something I'm kind of passionate about and I found very fulfilling for my career. And so that's kind of my hope, is to try to transfer that knowledge on to others here through this mechanism. These are my disclosures. And usually I say that and I pause for a couple seconds and I move on. I don't usually read them, and we'll come back to this later in the talk. So our learning objectives are to kind of discuss best tips and practices for academic radiologists to develop and maintain a side hustle that has some sort of monetary value. And sometimes that's real, money that comes in, physical money that you can count on paper or electronically. And sometimes it's perceived, or you're really developing skills for yourself that, could pay dividends long-term, but maybe you didn't take in cash at the moment. And then we want to discuss appropriately disclosing external activities and managing conflicts of interest. I think we can cover all this. So what is a side hustle? To me, that's a job that brings in extra money beyond your regular job and main source of income. So if you're here as an academic radiologist, that's your main job. And you may be subspecialized in something. And this is an awesome job. And we are so privileged to have this, to be able to focus on something that we're interested in, to do research in this, to do teaching and so forth. That's our main job, right? And the side hustle is really something that you're doing on the side. This could be something like, maybe you want to do some internal moonlighting to make some extra money or maintain some skills, or external moonlighting, teleradiology. Maybe you're consulting as a radiologist for one form or another. It could be a hospital system. It could be a startup company. You could be doing paid lectures, legal consulting, starting your own startup company, working for a startup, working for a big industry, managing a website, authoring a book, participating as an imaging core lab, lots of things that you can do. And one message that I'd want to have, just to remember this, is that the real thing that's going to help you long-term is your main job. That's where you're building your wealth. Think about it. We're going to earn millions of dollars over the course of our career. And comparatively, it's a little bit smaller typically for the side hustle. Sure, we're all going to hear about that person that sold their startup for millions of dollars and stuff. But for every one of those, there's hundreds of others that are just kind of earning some extra side cash and maybe some skills along the way. So we'll kind of cover that. Just keeping it in mind. I think that some of the chairs I've talked to stress that, remember that this is really a side project and your main job is your academic radiology position. But you can have these two interact with one another. And we'll look at that in a moment. So why do you want to do a side hustle? And sometimes I ask people this, and it's fine to say I want some extra income, or I'm going to put this all away and I'm going to invest it and build wealth. Those are great goals. That is certainly fine. But my pro tip, and we'll have a few of these in here, is to be able to provide your chair with other benefits. So imagine your chair is asking you, why do you want to do this? And you might say, in addition to making some extra income and taking my family on a vacation or buying something that I'm interested in, or whatever it is that you want your extra income for, that's fine. But why don't you say things like, if this is true, retain or gain clinical experience outside of your specialty. So I'll show you that I used to moonlight. I'm an abdominal radiologist, but I would moonlight and do that. It would involve other modalities and body areas that weren't in abdomen, and that helped me maintain those. So that was good for me. You could also develop a new area of expertise that helps your academic career and the radiology department and institution. Depends what that is. Maybe it's in legal consultation and understanding different nuances with that, or maybe it's doing a startup company and various aspects of raising funds or small business grants that you learn about. Those are all really good things. And you could complete a goal that stimulates your interest and passion, right? You really want to go after something that you're passionate about. So I don't know what that is for you. I do know what those are for me. On this next one, I want us to kind of look at comparing our main job and our side hustle and how they can positively interact with one another. Well, the best way, again, is probably to start with some sort of a goal. I would like to become a, and you can insert in there what it is you would like to become. Could be a chair, it could be whatever it is that you want to put into that statement. Or I want to gain expertise in, and then fill that out and go after it. Or it's maybe you want to start a company or just get involved in innovation or something. That was some of my passion area, and I think that'll be pretty evident here. So I did a diagnostic radiology residency, and of course I had clinical training with that, and I did a lot of research during that time and had research beforehand as well. So that was sort of my passion at the time. I started to do some other things. I happened to buy a house during residency and wanted some money was married, had children, wanted to take them on some vacations and do some fun things. So I started monitoring MRI scanner for contrast reaction and serving as an urgent care physician to make some extra money. And then I took a job as an imaging core lab rater. These are like for industry sponsored studies. They needed me to make aortic measurements for the vascular lab that I was in on CT. And I didn't realize it at the time, but I was learning a ton about that, about contracting, standard operating procedures. This was a fantastic experience. So I'm going to put some things in color to help you kind of see some interrelationships between these. I also did some internal moonlighting when I was an abdominal imaging fellow, and that helped me just kind of maintain my skill set. And then I started taking on real roles as an academic radiologist, starting as an assistant professor, working my way towards full professor over time. And, just various roles that I had there that were research roles, writing grants, directing various educational activities, just standard things that you would do as an academic radiologist. I got my first patent, which was very difficult, took a very long time to get that, didn't know what I was doing, made all kinds of mistakes with that, did manage to ultimately get it. And then over time, I got more of them. I got really good at this. I've had 20 some now, and now it's super easy for me to be able to do these and advise people on how to get a patent. I worked in the VA radiology for moonlighting. That helped me see another radiology practice and just how things function. That just opened my mind to some new ideas. I ultimately started an imaging core lab as a startup company. I learned about legal contracting, industry relations, conflict of interest management, and again, those standard operating procedures. Did other things as a faculty would do, took on a vice chair role for research, started doing some AI research, and then was hired to be the director of a human imaging core lab for an institution. And that had a lot to do with the skill set that I'd built to that point. So you can kind of see those interplaying and with each other. Started to do some lectures on AI. I like to speak, and it's a topic I'm passionate about. Did a little bit of legal consultation. I wanted to do that just to sort of broaden my horizons, think about what happens when these things go to malpractice? And I learned a lot from that. It was a very short-lived thing for me, but I did do a few of those just to kind of gain some skill. Ultimately started an AI tech company and learned how to raise funds, be a CEO, do license transfer, strategic partnerships, did FDA clearance, CE mark clearance. So that allowed me in the other company to say, hey, I think I could help other people do this. And so now we are what we call an imaging CRO and can help other companies get their FDA clearance and things like that, which is exciting, keeps me in the game. It helps me see other AI companies. Got to be a chief of AI in radiology, a co-chief. I was really excited about that. Started to get recognized at a national level for some of those things. And then locally joined our institution entrepreneurship development committee, the conflict of interest review board, and then ultimately now I'm a vice chair of innovation. So I don't know that I planned all of this. I certainly didn't know I was going to be an innovator when I started it all. I was more into the research side, but now I'm more into the innovation side. And so this was very fulfilling. And you can see on both sides of this a variety of things that sort of interplay with each other. So it really helped my academic career. And something that sets you apart in academics can be very good for you. That can be very good for your local institution. And it's really good leverage as you do look for another job at some point to say, hey, look at the skill sets that I've built here. And probably not a lot of people have these particular skill sets, and you could develop your own in whatever area of interest that you have. So after you get this, hey, what are you trying to do? What are the next steps after you develop your side hustle? There's several things you have to do. So this kind of gets into the nuts and bolts of what we need to be able to do as an academic radiologist to manage these things. You need to report this as an external activity, and we'll talk about that, and your conflict of commitment to your institution. Another thing you'll need to do, if it's relevant, is report any financial conflicts of interest to your institution. You'll need to inform the Conflict of Interest Review Board of any research that involves your conflict of interests. And then you have to disclose your conflicts of interest to all entities. These are lectures, societies, journals, etc. And then you can enjoy the benefits of your side hustle. You know, the first few times you do this, it seems kind of overwhelming. And then you're like, wait a minute, this is just hit repeat every single year. And as long as I don't hide anything, it's a piece of cake. And I'll kind of show you that. It's not terribly hard. It gets a little harder if you're doing something like making a device that you're sticking in someone's brain or something. It's a little bit different when you get into prospective invasive trials. But if you're doing other things like AI and things like that, then it's not terribly hard. So what is an external activity? These are the activities for an outside entity that draw upon your knowledge, skills, or abilities that an employee uses to fulfill his or her institutional roles. So you have built a tremendous skill set if you are a mid-career radiologist or early career or late career in radiology, and that can be applied in many other ways besides interpreting images. So here are some examples, like consulting for a company, just being paid to do lectures or presenting, performing, or speaking for a fee. You know, you could work for a startup company or start your own, serve as an expert witness, you know, participate in a board of directors for a company or similar governing body, be on a scientific advisory board for a committee or something. Appointments or other commitments to academic or research institutions also count. Those are all external activities, and they require some of your time. So these need to be reported. External activities really typically need to be reported in your institution on an annual basis and usually within a month of a new activity. Every institution has their own rules. So much of what I'm going to tell you from these slides on are just kind of what I know from this institution. I've seen in others. There are some obvious nuances between each institution, and you may have to learn those at your particular institution. So how would you report this? Well, most of the time it's like digital. So if we look kind of small at the font here, I'm saying I'm in medicine employee, and are you an investigator responsible for design, conduct research? So I said, yes, I am. Are you a full-time faculty member? In my case, yes. And what are you trying to do here? I'm trying to request for an external activity. So this is actually a request, and you'll fill out more information. Just an example here is like, what's your time commitment? At our institution, it makes you only report the current year. And it says, hey, wait a second, you chose a day before today. Why did you do that? Because you should have been doing this before starting the activity. So in this case, I'm like, well, I was already doing it last year. I'm just continuing that. So that's a key point here, is turn this in before starting the activity, because this is a permission slip. This is kind of like getting your IRB or doing your research without an IRB. You don't do that. So you don't do your external activity without getting your permission to do so, because it could violate your contract and your role there. So I say, how often am I going to do this? Every institution has a different number of days that you could request off. 20 is the maximum at the institution that I'm at. but every institution has a different one. And that's not 20 days off of clinical service. That's like you could potentially have up to 20 days of your academic time potentially be used for this. I don't actually use 20, by the way, not even close to that. Then you have to do a detailed description of it. And, will this take it, will classes or patient care administrative responsibilities require you to reschedule things? So thankfully in radiology, a lot of times you don't have to, but if you're like, I need a day every Monday, that's different. You'd obviously have to work that out with your chair and section head and so forth. So you also need to give information on how much you're going to make, and there's different ways of making money. I was saying, hey, I'm going to consult here is the main thing. I'm just saying this as an example, and I might consult at $250 an hour for up to 10 weeks or 10 hours per week rather. And then you'd have to say, what about any other conflict of interest questions? Do you supervise anyone? Do you have input on services or products described by your institution? In my case, I do, because I run a human imaging core lab, and a lot of the stuff I do overlaps with that. So that leads into conflicts of interest. This is really just reporting the external activity at this point. We'll talk about conflict of interest reporting in just a moment. So, and does this compete with UAB? That comes up as well, or UAB being the institution that I'm at. And, are you using any institutional resources? It may be okay. Sometimes you can say, just be honest. Yes, I would like to. I'm going to do legal consulting. It's more convenient for me to do it from my academic office. Probably your chair and others would approve something like that. If you're like, I'm going to use this computer and all kinds of horsepower and servers to address something that gets me paid and doesn't help the institution, probably not going to be supporting that, right? So you need to be doing most of this on your own computers, your own phones, separate from the institution. But if you're going to use institutional resources, please let them know so that you don't get in trouble for that. So if you've reported that, my pro tip is turn in your external activity before starting the activity. So we just said that, but I wanted to really drive that home, that that's kind of what's important. And what happens next, this will depend on your institution, but typically your chair, possibly a section head as well, and a top institutional leader will review your external activity. Now, sometimes the chair will say, this looks great. I think it's going to be a good opportunity for you. And then the institutional leader is, this does not look great, and I reject it. And so there's sometimes they'll come back, may ask for additional information. And I have definitely seen cases where they have denied the request. Most of these requests are accepted. And some of that has to do with the experience of when you put this in. So talk to someone in your institution or your department who's done these kind of things before, and they may help you with some of the language you might want to use for your particular form set when you do this. Just as an aside, or kind of related to this, professional public service activities are considered part of an employee's institutional responsibilities, whether or not they're separately compensated. So some of these examples are like lecturing, presenting, moderating, board members, and other service activities for scientific meetings, seminars, or CME materials, all things we've done. If that's for like the US, state, or local government agency, an academic institution, nonprofit entities, including like big societies that we typically join are nonprofit, or civic groups, then this is a professional public service activity. And typically you can report these, but you typically don't have to, because they're considered part of your university role. It's only when you start to make significant money from that, or if it's a for-profit entity or something like that, then that doesn't fall under this. This is for not-for-profit and other type of agencies. So disclose all professional public service activities in your NIH BioSketch, your CV, and grant materials. That is definitely required. And then disclose to your institution if you're being paid for it. At our institution, a $5,000 amount per year would trigger that and just require a disclosure. What are they going to do about that? Not much. They just want to know, and they need to be able to manage it. If you're making $500,000 from that, someone's going to question exactly what is it they're paying you that much for. And that may introduce a significant conflict of interest in your day-to-day job when you start making those kind of dollars from a side hustle. Just as an aside here too, you may have a non-compete clause. So some academic medical centers have employee contracts that have a restricted covenant that prohibits the employee from competing with the business during or for a period of time after their employment, oftentimes defined by a particular distance or time period, or both. of when you cannot compete with your institution. You just kind of want to be aware of that. And we'll kind of come back to this. A good example is like moonlighting or employment at a competing hospital. Sometimes that's allowable. It depends on the experience and what's available, but sometimes it's not. And that's reasonable. And just because you don't have a non-compete clause doesn't mean that your chair or institution is necessarily required to allow you to do these things. And there's other reasons for that we'll get into in a minute. One of them being this, a conflict of commitment. So this is a circumstance where an employee's external activities compromise their ability to carry out their primary obligation commitments to their academic employer. So an example is an external activity that requires a large commitment of time that could interfere with their institutional position. Now, depending on your energy level and so forth, maybe you're saying, I want to do 20 hours a week doing this awesome external activity that I'm super excited about. Typically, a good example of this is I have a startup company. It requires a lot of work. And if you're going to ask for more than 20 hours a week, I think you should be prepared for a big no, just in my opinion. This leads to potentially to burnout, right? So there's a certain amount that your chair and your institution wants to protect you as an employee and your personal health. So you have to be reasonable with what your request is. If you're going to request more than that, if I was your chair, I'd say, fantastic. Why don't you go part-time for your academic job so you can also do these other things that you're super interested in? So that's different ways that your chair could handle those kind of situations. Let's kind of move on to conflict of interest. This is a circumstance when an individual's financial, professional, or personal interests affect, or even just have the appearance of affecting, judgment and exercising a duty or responsibility to the institution. So just the appearance of this is kind of what you want to avoid. It's super easy to avoid problems with this by simply disclosing them, and we'll get to that in a moment. So anything of financial interest is anything of monetary value accepted or owned by a faculty member or their spouse or dependents who control the investment decisions. So like mutual funds, you don't really control the investment decisions there, so that wouldn't count. But other things would, as these examples are. So if you're paid to participate in external activities through a salary, consulting, or other fees, gifts, or honoraria, that's definitely a financial conflict of interest. If you have ownership or income from stock shares or equity interest in like a privately held company, then that also could be the same as a financial conflict of interest, or certainly be perceived as such. Income received from royalties from products or textbooks, income received from commercialization of intellectual property, so like licensing a patent, options, or other revenue generating activity, and sponsored or reimbursed travel cans. So even for those professional activities, if they start to reimburse your travel, it starts to hit a big number, you kind of need to report that as a potential conflict of interest, because it's definitely influencing you as that number starts to grow. And every institution has a different number that they use, but for many of these, there is no number at all, $0, it's the perception. So don't think that you have to be making money to report these things. That is not true. If there's the perception, like a patent, for example, may be making $0 for you, and it may not even be issued yet, but that is an example that you have to disclose. Hey, I have this patent in this area, and I'm, in the back of your mind, hopefully you're thinking, I hope this thing takes off and is worth something someday. So that's how it's influencing you, even though at this very instant, it hasn't paid you a single dollar. So do you need to report these? Typically, yes, on an annual basis. And then within 30 days of a new conflict of interest. Most societies, I just got a whole slew of them in recently, are asking us on an annual basis, hey, update your conflict of interest. If you don't have any, it's pretty easy. If you do, it takes some time, and every society does it differently, and every journal does it differently. And I find it hard to exactly fit my stuff in there at times, but you can figure it out over time and just do your best to be honest about it. So it's similar to an external activity. Okay, so sometimes you have to do two of these. Okay, so the external activity is like getting permission to do the activity and that conflict of commitment. This is your financial interest aspects of it. So again, I'm a UAB employee, I'm an investigator, and what am I doing here? I'm trying to disclose a financial interest. And they even had some new annual requirement here that you can see was flagged on that. And I had to take a course and stuff every so many years. I have to take a course on what I need to do to inform or report my conflicts of interest. And then you have to say how much of something you own. Like, do you or your spouse or dependents own something that should be reported? So I said yes, and I'm cutting it off here. There are tons of things, if you scroll down on this particular form, that are different forms of ownership. And this is also super confusing because there's really an infinite number of ways to own things. So a lot of times you'll find these forms try to box you into answering something, or you honestly look at it and go, I don't even see where to put this thing that I have that's conflict of interest. Most forms have an other section, and I would highly recommend, if you can't put in all of your conflicts of interest into like these boxed out regions, put it under the other category. I find almost no harm whatsoever in doing that. And I'll show you the one time where I did have like, relative harm from disclosing information. Generally, it's a super benign process. So you have to be able to report this. There's other things you have to disclose any intellectual property. So just because you turn in a patent, do not assume these are two different sections of a gigantic organization that you're probably in. So when you turn in a patent, that's one group, and that's your tech transfer office and working on that. And then on the other side of that, you need to say, hey, I have this conflict of interest that's potentially financially viable for me. So you still have to turn it in into a separate form for that particular conflict of interest. And a lot of times your institutions, particularly lately, are very interested in what you're doing with foreign countries and foreign interests from different countries. And you can name off some of the countries that raise eyebrows, and you definitely want to say if you're doing something for a company from one of those or what's going on, and just be honest about it. Again, it's not necessarily that someone's going to block you. They simply want to know what's going on and potentially be able to track that and ask you additional questions. Okay, so what about a pro tip? Disclose any potential financial conflict of interest. This is potential, not just real ones, but anything that even has the perception of that. I mean, it's better to over disclose, okay? When in doubt, just do it, just disclose. It's very easy to do typically with these electronic forms. So there's a little bit difference here between a conflict of interest and this conflict of interest review board. So this is a board that identifies, reviews, and manages employee and institutional financial conflicts of interest as they relate to research. So this is if you're an academic radiologist, you might be doing research and you need to be able to report these to the CIRB. So this is an institution can also have a conflict of interest, by the way. So if this is a circumstance where the institutional financial interests have the appearance of affecting institutional processes, maybe for the design, conducting, reporting, review, or oversight of the research. So imagine you're a patient and you heard that your institution has this really cool drug or imaging process, and you are doing research on that. They're going to be like, hey, are they influenced? Are they doing the right thing here with this research? This is where the CIRB comes in also to help manage institutional conflicts of interest. And these are just some examples. Typically, the numbers are much higher here than it would be for your personal conflict of interest. So ownership interest of 100,000 or more in a publicly traded for-profit organization. That is our definition at my institution. Yours could be different. Any ownership interest in a private organization or a startup. So a lot of times if you form a startup through the institution, they will have a piece of ownership in that. And suddenly that introduces an institutional conflict of interest, which can make it hard to do research on your own idea right at your own institution. Typically not a big deal for retrospective things. Bigger if you're sticking probes into someone's brain, that might not be allowed at your own institution because they have some ownership in it. And the perception of that is not great when people are coming in and saying, yes, we own a piece of this thing that I'm going to stick in your brain. I sure hope it works because we'll make millions off of that. So that's the perception. Patients may not do that very well. And so institutions set up mechanisms to protect patients from that. Here's how you would do it. This is for your conflict of interest. Any research associated with your financial interest must be reported to the CIRB. And there's probably different ways to do this. So this is the Conflict of Interest Review Board. It's just, in mine, this is just a piece of our IRB application. And I check this tiny little box. That's it. I mean, that's all I have to do. They will typically gather information on this conflict of interest, often if it's a patent or whatever it is, and they will come back and ask additional questions if they need to, and they will manage it. This can slow down your IRB submission, so that's true, but you need to be able to do it so they can manage it and give you a management plan. So you need to disclose any financial conflict of interest when you submit your IRB application. And then after that, they will establish a conflict of interest management plan. They'll submit a written plan to you and your supervisor. This could be your chair. The plans may be different for each IRB application. So I sometimes have a lot of inventions and things that I've done, and some of them are only relevant to this or that IRB, but not the other ones. And so they have to keep track of that. And it gets very difficult the more of these things that you do. So I tend to help out my CIRB and guide them as to which ones are relevant and which ones aren't. And they're always double checking. It's like trust but verify kind of a thing. So, but I help them get there a little bit faster by just disclosing and talking with them. So you're going to have to be able to implement this conflict of interest plan. Typically your chair is responsible for that. Sometimes it's like all the way to the level of the dean, but typically in a medical center, that's not feasible. So it's down to the chair level. And sometimes your chair will designate that to someone else. That maybe one of the vice chairs will help manage that, or sometimes even an administrator will do that. And they'll help you manage this plan. So what does the plan even look like? It kind of looks like this typically. At the first point is ensure transparency and research through disclosing your financial interests to research personnel. So that could be your students and your lab people. Hey, just letting you know, I have this conflict of interest. Sometimes I do multi-institutional studies and I put it in writing right up front when I ask someone, hey, I want you to participate in this study, just so you know, I have a patent in this area and, or it is or is not licensed, these kind of things. I tell people right up front. You also have to tell your study participants if it's relevant, and all publications and presentations. That's fairly easy to do, just don't forget to do it. Prevent undue influence on trainees and employees. So you can't go and use this, your financial conflict of interest shouldn't be interfering with the way that you interact with your trainees and employees. And that's certainly possible depending on the situation. So the management plan will usually set up a situation to avoid that. So I have things that have to do with my core lab. And so certain decisions in the core lab that I run are actually transferred on to someone else because of my conflict of interest. And we set that up in a way so that it really protects me and I don't get in trouble because of it. So I'm happy about it. I do not participate in data management or data analysis. That's probably not activated enough in my opinion. And the reason I say that is, we'll get to the slide in a moment, but a lot of journals require that. So your institution may not say that. They'd be like, oh, look, I can do my own measurements and I can do my own statistical analysis and submit to the journal. And then when you get to the journal, they're like, no. With that, that's way too much of a conflict of interest, reject. So be aware of that. So you're responsible for following the CIRB management plan. That's your responsibility. Ultimately, the chair will help you, but it is your responsibility. Just kind of keep that in mind. So you want to disclose these financial conflicts of interest in presentations and publications and to all societies. I find this very easy. I gave you a disclosure slide right at the beginning. I said, I have the following disclosures, and I paused for a moment. I don't rush it so fast that nobody could possibly read this, but you could just glance at this and say, this person has a lot of conflicts of interest. Maybe that's going to influence their presentation. And that's the whole point of putting it out there. So they know to take it with a grain of salt, the things that you say. And if I suddenly start heavily talking about something that's clearly related to one of these, people are going to start to say, maybe I need to question that a little bit further. It doesn't mean you can't do it. And I think conflicts of interest are often a sign of expertise and a good thing. So view them as a good thing, but it also does mean people have to pay attention to your results and understand what was your role, how did you protect this research that you're presenting or from bias and your educational things. Are you mentioning company names? You really shouldn't be doing that. Typically, you don't need to. I'm tending to avoid that minus this particular slide, avoiding mentioning company names and things. For RSNA, this is just an example. Their form just changed this year from what I can remember from last year. And how you report your RSNA activities for this CME and so forth. So I tell them what my conflicts of interest here are. I tell all of them, as many as I can. I don't see any harm in letting them know at all. There's almost no penalty for disclosing these. The only penalties that I've seen from a lecture standpoint are that if you're going to talk directly about your product or something like that, it can invalidate CME. It typically does not if you don't mention the name. So why would you sit there and mention the name of some product or company that you have? Just don't. Just talk about it in generalizations and use other examples. If that's how I handle it, and I've never had anyone reject me from CME when I remove the actual name and don't get too heavily into my own personal inventions and so forth. Authorship is something similar. Like I said, the journals have financial conflict of interest policies, and they're often more rigorous than your institution. And this is how you kind of get burnt. Especially when you're new to this, is you may do some research, then you discover some great thing after doing it, patent it or something, and then you try to submit your paper, but you were the one who was the primary author and did all the research and all the biostats. And that can be a bit more challenging to get that published in today's world. So in general, you want to plan ahead if you can. For research, I give first author to someone else. Okay, if you're getting mid-career, it's a good time to start transferring it to someone else and being the senior author. Maybe put your name last as an example. And then I like to set up the data analysis, the data gathering and analysis that's handled by someone else. Actually, two people in my case. I'll have a team that gathers the data and they will lock it away somewhere. And we can talk about it and I help them with certain aspects of it, but I don't access the data. And then I actually send my analysis off site. You could use your own biostatistician, but sometimes I'm worried that when I get to journal level that someone's going to say, hey, that's not fair. Like your biostatistician, you're at that institution is influenced by the institutional conflict of interest. So I actually use an offsite biostatistician for my research just to eliminate those conflicts of interest. It takes a minute or two to set these things up, but once you do, it gets to be just easy to be able to do this and hit repeat on it. Another little tip, gifts, awards, and prizes, right? So let's say you're working for a company and they want to buy you a dinner or something like that. This is prohibited at most institutions, just to be honest, okay? A lot of people turn a blind eye to this. And, but it ultimately is prohibited. And you should be aware of like the Physician Payment Sunshine Act that requires manufacturers of drugs, medical devices, and group purchasing orgs to report to the CMS payments given to physicians and teaching hospitals. So this will show up. If you go to RSNA and Big Vendor X takes you out to dinner, they're probably going to report this in here. It's not necessarily a bad thing. I'm just telling you that they're going to report it. But your institution may say, hey, wait a second, we have a strict policy against this. Why did you do that? So someone is reporting it. It just goes with like many things, just live your life with high integrity and don't do it. And you can certainly afford your own dinner at RSNA and other places. So little tip there that's how I do it. I just pay for my own dinner. Yes, it's fun. It'd be nice to have someone pay for my dinner and get some extravagant thing, but I just avoid it personally. So after all this, you should be able to enjoy the benefits of your side hustle. That might be some cash. That might be just enriching your career, like in the bottom left. You're just like, this is great. I like what I'm doing. I'm helping the team because of these new skills that I've learned. And so what you're practicing is going to grow and make you stronger. And that's kind of some of the benefits of doing a side hustle. So kind of in review, and then we'll do a few cases after this. Keep in mind this about your main job. What a privilege to be an academic radiologist that is. But now you can also get some of these side hustle things going, whether it's to make money or other things that you're trying to get out of it. And we talked about those. Maybe gaining experience outside of your specialty is enough, or really new skills that you want to learn, or complete some goal that stimulates your interest and passion. And it may open up new avenues that you never thought of before. For me, it did. I had no idea I was going to be getting into this innovation so heavily, but I love it. And so now it's kind of my passion. How do you initiate it? We talked about it. Getting these external activities reported, reporting any conflict of interest that are financially related. If you're doing research, reporting it to the Conflict of Interest Review Board, disclosing your conflict of interest to all entities. When you do a lecture, put that slide up. The societies, keep up with it, inform them. It only takes a few minutes to put it in there. And with the journals, they require it. When you submit a journal article, it's required in there. And then you can just enjoy the benefits. So we kind of talked about this, before starting your activity is when you want to turn on that external activity. Make sure you turn it in, get the permission before you do it, not after, okay? Otherwise, you're just begging for forgiveness. The conflict of interest reporting, just do it, just overdo it if you have to. When in doubt, just disclose. I found very, very few negatives to doing that. Like I said, I've never been turned down on a lecture, an invited lecture, if I just take out names. And sometimes they ask me, Andrew, we know you got a ton of conflicts of interest, send us your slides in advance. And I do, and there's no names of anything that I'm doing in there. And hopefully they're good lectures and people have me come back. And then the last one, just disclosing your financial interest is very easy for the societies and so forth. You show your slide, submit it to the society. It's pretty easy to do it. And we talked about it with the journal, although I didn't show you an example. It'll go in like your cover letter or some other section when you do the journal. Thank you for the opportunity to present. I thought we might take some cases. I'll kind of walk through these, and then maybe we'll have a few minutes to take some questions and things like that.
Did you want to make the cases into a discussion so people can?
We can, for sure. Absolutely. It's a great idea.
Prefer to just walk through those?
I think we could turn them into discussion. People could, go with that. And if we get lucky, someone will ask the next case and I'll be like, awesome, you just led my next slide or something. So we'll start with, so these were the tips. If you were sort of watching this live and wanted to cheat a little bit, this is one of those like save screen kind of things. It doesn't mean that this is cookie cutter, because it's not. It's not really a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 necessarily, but this would help you with the test that you're about to do, which is kind of going through these cases and things. All right, so you're an academic, or you have an academic radiologist, could be you, could be somebody else who wants to moonlight as an ER radiologist at a hospital that's 1 hour from their main employer. Anybody on the call want to help take this? Like, what would be the next step? Let's say it's you want to moonlight as an ER radiologist. You're not even an ER radiologist, but you want to do this at a hospital. What kind of steps would you do here? I'll help you on some of these. We'll get you started here. So you might want to think about, like, well, geez, we told you before that this is an external activity, right? It's potentially one that competes too with what you're doing. So that also depends too. So I would sort of say, if you really want to get it good about this, you might want to review your employee contract to look for that non-compete clause. Even if it's there, you can still have the discussion with your chair. And if it's not there, they may still turn you down, but that's what you want to do. Discuss the opportunity with the chair. You certainly want to have some things with you. You can't just say, I want to do this. You need to have an idea of how many hours you're going to do this for. Why are you doing this? And I would, again, my pro tip was to explain the benefit to the employee, that's to you, and to the institution. So say, hey, this is really going to help me. I'm an abdominal radiologist, but I don't want to lose the skills in neuro and chest and other things. I think this is going to help me out. It also helps me with my speed, gives me some extra cash. I want to go on vacation with my family, or I want to build some wealth. These are good for me, for the institution, to keep up these skills, because it keeps me happy and keeps me here at this institution. That would be fine to say something like that. And there may be a lot of other reasons to be able to answer that, but those are fine. And then you can do the external activity first or after talking to the chair. That's usually like a form that we talked about, but you're still going to need to turn that in. Hopefully your chair knows enough about that to tell you, make sure you turn in an external activity request and then wait for the approval, because it's not just the chair approving that. It is also a higher level institution official. I don't know what to name that because it depends on the institution, what that person is called. Seemed like a fair one. That one's like a starter. Okay. So I get a little bit harder here.
So
doesn't mean that
there's a suggestion for a case to discuss as a group. I wonder if maybe we could use that as an example to make sure we kind of address kind of dual task.
Yeah, I like it.
How does that work? So in the chat, AB has written as a possible case, donating images to a case repository like StatDX or Elsevier in two different cases. So either with compensation or without compensation, what would be the conflict of interest implications? And how does this differ from writing a textbook for Elsevier?
Okay, so yeah, let's go with the easier one, like a textbook and stuff, right? You have certainly a potential perceived conflict of interest there. You may not even get paid for this, but people are wondering that. So do you need to disclose it? For sure. And if you are getting paid, you definitely need to disclose it as well. Is that a problem when you talk to your chair? Is your chair going to like this? Probably, almost certainly they would. I think that would be a great thing. It's going to teach you new skills. You're extending your educational reach and so forth. It's good for your promotion. So that one's kind of easy. The sharing of images just kind of depends. So, who do those, this is a really complicated one. I'll try to get it in about 60 seconds here. Who owns the images? The hospital actually owns the images. Are they allowed to give those images away? Well, not unless they're de-identified. And typically most institutions, they can actually do that. They can sell images to do that. But typically people want to do this under some sort of a research agreement and a data use agreement that restricts the use of those. And you have to take into other things too about facial recognition on images and things like that. So there is a lot there. That's more than just I'm going to turn in a form and hope somebody signs off on this. That's talking with your informatics group and talking with your chair about, do we want to do this as an institution? If it's for research and generalizable knowledge, sure. And sometimes that involves an industry sponsor. So one of the things I do is exactly what this person is asking. We do that both with societies, with other institutions, and with industry partners that want to help make AI. I mean, how are they going to make these things if we don't? It's beneficial to your institution in many ways to give those images, because now that AI algorithm is more likely to work at your institution. So I hope that kind of answers it. The data use agreement is kind of key. That is to how far can this go? Can these images just be shared with anyone afterwards? No, typically not. That's a terrible idea. Oftentimes you'll have something that is much more restrictive than that helps protect both sides. So that's part of it. That takes a lot more contracting and effort. And so work with somebody who knows what they're doing if that's kind of your goal.
So I guess, can I ask a follow-up question? I guess
Sure.
I'm going to. So you've got this extensive knowledge of all these nuances. So you have a really comprehensive understanding of like the questions that need to be asked and the questions that need to be answered and like the people that you need to contact. Like if you're at an institution that perhaps doesn't have a you.
Yeah, yeah. Well,
How would
hopefully
you-
this enduring material will help, and then you should probably send an email to me or something. I'd be happy to help you as number one. Number two, there's almost always someone that does. It may not be in your department, is perhaps what you're saying, right? And so that's the challenge. But the person that knows your institution best is, unless they're brand new, is almost always your chair. And they should be your ally and be able to help and guide you. So sometimes this is a talking to the chair. I think most chairs are approachable and they're going to want to hear what you have to say and help you with this process. But they may not be an expert. So I see one of the questions here on like an STTR grant. They're like, look, I've never written one of those. Our department's never done that. Sometimes the institution's like, we've never done that. And so then it can become a bit more challenging. And that's when you need to get outside of that. That's why like AUR is a great society to be able to kind of interface with these people that do know how to do these things. And I think that's what I would recommend is probably everyone who's on this call right here who's could be a good resource to connect you with someone if they don't personally have the answer.
And Angela, let me ask you a follow-up question, since this is a lot of educators hopefully watching this this presentation. So we touched a lot on the conflict of interest, and we've glossed a little bit over on the financial aspect of it. And so just with respect to this particular case, one of the things that I think people run into when they're doing things like editing or writing a book for the first time is the royalty agreements and deciding how you approach those, because you can either choose to take a lump sum from a lot of the publishers or a percentage of sales. And I think a lot of people don't really know what the best approach to that is. So maybe you could give us a little bit of an insight into that.
Yeah, I have no idea would be the fastest answer to say there, because it's going to depend obviously on the situation, what the likelihood of that book going the distance is. The likely if you're doing it for a company like Elsevier or something, they're going to be around. So you're not going to have to worry that they're going to disappear or something like that. So that's more the financial side, which I do find super challenging, is like to negotiate the price on something is often hard and takes some consulting with people that have done it before. So you have some ballpark, like should I be asking for 90% or 2%? Like you sometimes it's really hard to even know where to start, and depending on what the situation is. I'm sure a book deal is on the smaller scale of that, but like other things may be much higher that you need to be asking for. Nothing is 90, by the way, but those are great questions, and that's a different one than the conflict. So the conflict of interest is handled the same way either way. You're saying, hey, I'm going to do this external activity and write this book and submit that. Once you kind of do that, you're like, look, now I have this royalty deal that just started to hit at the point where it potentially has become a real book and is going to be sold. And then you just report that as conflict of interest. How you handle the percent stuff, that is the art of negotiation. And, that takes some time, and you'll get better at it. You'll never get better at it if you don't do it, though. So that's part of it. It's just doing it, getting your foot in the water, testing it out a little bit.
I have one more question that is relevant, I think, to the first case that's on the screen. And the question is, as a part-time employee or less than 1.0 FTE, do you still need to disclose if you have a consulting job?
Typically you do. They want to know for the conflict of interest, yes. Depends on the institution and depends if you're a state organization or not as well. But even at where I am, a 1% employee still needs to disclose all of these things and still needs to have the management plan. Because like if you're doing research, for example, it still could heavily influence your research no matter what your percent effort is, just as an example. So it typically doesn't change much based on your amount of employment, but every institution is different. So there could be some out on that. My guess is it'd have to be under half time to even have a consideration for not having to report something.
I just got another question. I'm sorry.
Sure.
So the question, these questions are great. So I'm not sorry that I'm getting more questions. So this question is relating to the discussion about the sharing of images. And the question is, doesn't the patient ultimately own their images rather than the institution?
They do not. So they don't. That's why they have to come back to you and ask for them again. And we, as a courtesy, will give it to them again if we didn't give it to them on the disc in the first place. But it's the institution that owns it from a legal standpoint. And then from there, the institution can do what it wants. Generally, an academic medical center is going to be a bit reserved and value those images. You can't actually charge, you shouldn't actually charge for an inherent value of the images. That's considered unethical. Can you legally? Yes. But we don't when we do something like that. What we would charge for is the time it takes to find the images, gather the images, de-identify them, transfer them, store them, if needed, other steps, annotate and so forth. Those things, are reasonable to charge. I think a fair price is important. It shouldn't be some ridiculous price, but you really shouldn't put a price on the actual images. That's generally considered unethical. I only know that because I'm involved in it. That's a more field specific sort of a thing. All right, let's take another one here. We'll try maybe one or two more, and then we'll try to come back to STTR types of things and SBIR type of grants. So let's say you're an academic radiologist who wants to learn about malpractice, or maybe you just got approached by a law firm and they said they want you to provide some legal consultation for cases, and you were smart enough not to just immediately say, I'm in, and just start working. And you said, hey, I'm going to talk to someone else who knows about this. And you maybe set up a retainer fee, which is like, hey, you got to pay me $1,000 to even get started here, because I don't want to be wasting a bunch of time looking at this and realize that it was only a half hour's worth of work or something. And you might set a pretty high rate, like $400 an hour. I've heard higher ones than this. I'm just like shooting out some numbers here. It's not unreasonable to say something like this. Now, what's the next step? I mean, like, you get asked to do this and they're like, I'm sending you this CDs now, or DVDs. They're coming in the mail to your house. What's next? So let's kind of go over this one a little bit. It's really not too hard, but I would probably pause on the legal consultation. I can't help it if they send me the images. I don't have to look at them, but I can't help that it arrived in my mailbox or something in that particular example. But I'd want to discuss this with the chair and say, hey, I'm really interested in this, and here's why. Again, it could go back to just, I want to make some money, or I think this would be really interesting. We don't really have an expert on malpractice in our group, and I just wanted to learn about that. And then, you could turn in your external activity request again, and then wait for the approval. So kind of a simple process to be able to handle it. But there's other things that come into this. I can just tell you, having done this for a short stint, is should the radiologist have a lawyer review the contract with you as the reviewer? Should you have a separate lawyer, take a look at that one? Of course you should. Like, that's, unless you're really awesome at reading contracts and things and happen to be able to do that from whatever skill set you learned in the past, get some help on that. That's like taking a new job and having a contract thrown in front of you and just trusting that it's okay is probably not a great idea. You should have someone look at it. And then, as an expert providing testimony, you will probably be required to submit your CV to a law firm. Just so you know, they are often required to share that with the defendant. So that defendant's going to see that you are the expert testimony. And sometimes it's actually unclear when these law firms come to you, which side are you sitting on? Are you helping someone, prevent being sued, or are you helping sue someone, or, you're providing testimony that, yeah, that's an egregious mistake. Holy smokes, what were they thinking? And it can be a little bit unclear in that. So if it is unclear, you might want to ask them. It's not uncommon that, especially when you're new to this, that they will tell you, well, we kind of want to keep you blinded to this. And sometimes you're never fully blinded, and they can even bias you in the way that they ask you to look at something, or in the way that they present the information to you. And obviously it's not presented to you in the middle of a busy day, like what you're doing in your reading room. And so you have to kind of keep that in mind. So I found it pretty challenging, and it really wasn't for me because of those little nuances. So kind of ducked out of that, but I thought it was important. I was trying to build a skill set that's really well-rounded, so that maybe someday I could be an academic chair. And so that's part of the reason I participated in it. And I didn't personally like it, so I got out of it. Anybody else with experience on like legal consultation or doing this? And there's some people that make tremendous amounts of money from that. And then, that has its own connotations and thought process around, why is that person making so much money doing that? And it could be a good thing, but sometimes the perception is not so good when you're doing it for those kind of reasons, to make a ton of money. All right, we'll go on for one more. This one gets a little harder. I said AI here because I like AI. So an academic radiologist has developed a new AI algorithm submit an invention disclosure. This is your intellectual property disclosure, to be specific, to their institution. And the institution says, hey, this is great, we love it. We've done some work and we decide we want to submit a provisional patent, and they do that. Okay, so that's not an actual patent, kind of holds the space for about a year and then gets followed up with a non-provisional patent. It could take some time to be issued. Okay, so the academic radiologist then says, I want to complete some retrospective study. I use that just to keep things simple and validate the AI algorithm. And I want to present my results at RSNA or another meeting and submit to a major scientific journal. So it's really not just what is the next step, but what are the next steps? This is quite a bit. Okay, so you're going to see a lot pop up here when we kind of go through this one. So of course, just because you turned in the invention, we said this earlier, it doesn't mean that the people that are managing conflicts of interest know about it. So you still need to turn in your financial conflict of interest to the institution. So that's kind of the first step. And then if you're doing research on this, now you need to disclose the conflict of interest to the Conflict of Interest Review Board, or the CIRB, during your IRB submission. In my case, it was check yes in the box, I have a conflict of interest. Simple as that. Don't forget to check that yes. Okay, that's very important. And unfortunately, a lot of these times they don't catch it later. So it's your job to inform them. You want to catch it up front and make sure that a management plan is put in place. So that's the third one. Follow the CIRB management plan. Oftentimes it's really easy. Don't do uninfluence on your employees and your students, and make sure to disclose this in your slides and then for your paper and your presentation. Pretty simple to do that. I still recommend, again, getting someone else to be first author and set up the study so that others manage the data and conduct the statistical analysis. I just think it's good practice. It's not easy to do that the first time, but once you've established that pipeline, you'll get really good at this, and then you can invent like crazy and have a good time doing it. Then you want to disclose the financial conflict of interest to the RSNA when you're doing this. So we showed in a slide of that, and then also to the journal at the time of the submission. It sounds like a lot, but it's really just disclose, listen to the management plan, disclose. I mean, it's actually fairly simple once you do it a few times, but it seems like a lot at first. So just you have these slides, you have these lists. If you needed to go back to them, hopefully they would provide you some guidance on how to do this. So that's the only, I think it says case 2, but that was case 3. And that is my last, actual case. So I'm going to come off of screen sharing here for a moment, and then just kind of, maybe we could do 1 or 2 more questions or thoughts around this.
I have one more question that came into the chat to me, and that is, if there's no potential for present or future earnings, can the activity represent a conflict of interest? For example, donating an MRI case of a pituitary microadenoma to Radipedia.
Yeah, I think if you don't, it depends, it's hard for you to donate that case. You don't actually own the case. So that concept of getting images from your site to the Cancer Imaging Archive or something like that, it's not really you, right? That's the institution that's doing that. So you're not going to earn anything from that. So that wouldn't need reported. That is just donating a case for something like that. Or if you're doing a case for RSNA or something and anonymizing it, that's certainly not something I'm reporting. You're not going to make any money off of that. There's no chance of making money off of that. But if you have something, so the submitting case things, if there's no monetary thing, I don't think you need to report it at all. But there are other things where just the perception that you might make money becomes important. So just kind of keep that in mind. If it looks like you could make money, probably do need to disclose it for a period of time. You also need to, I forgot to mention too, you need to just in general on disclosing things, you kind of need to disclose for a while after the fact. So even when you get a grant from industry, you need to disclose it during the time of that grant. And then oftentimes for up to 3 years after. And I do the same thing with speaking arrangements. I just kind of use 3 years as my guide. So I may have talked to a company one time, I gave a talk for a company, and then now I got to report it for 3 years. So if you don't like doing that, and it's not worth the $1,000 or $2,000 they pay you or whatever it is they're paying you, then don't take the job in the first place. But if it is worth it to you and you don't like disclosing is easy for you, then just go ahead and do it. It's pretty easy to disclose. I see Tess has a question if we want to do that.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew, so much. Great presentation. Congratulations, by the way, on all of your successes. So you may have mentioned this when talking about disclosures when presenting a talk, for instance. And I often, as an audience member, sit there kind of raising an eyebrow like, why do they need to disclose that? That doesn't seem relevant to their talk. Is it, again, on the same line of if you're just being perceived as having made money from these entities, it's important to disclose, or is there something in particular that links a particular activity to the slide presentation?
I think it's a little both, of course. And what I use as my own guide is I find it too hard for every society to read through their lines about, is this related to your presentation? I find this language very difficult. So to me, I'm just going to act like it's all related and just cover it that way, because there's no penalty to say this all could be related, and then, but the reality is I have in the past split them, especially if I really want people to know, because I'm worried about perception. I'll say, hey, these two are directly related to this topic that I'm about to talk about. And I'll say these other ones are unrelated, but they do influence me overall. So I list them all either way, no matter what. And I've done the ones that influence most a couple different ways, literally separating them on the slides or bolding and coloring them so that people their eyes are drawn to it. And I'm given the most faithful way of presenting it that I possibly can without cutting into my 6-minute talk very much.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for that.
Yeah. Because you could spend forever on it, right? It's also like thanking everybody. One time I did a study with, I don't know, 20 some radiologists in it. I had them pop up really fast and thank you, everybody. Thanks so much. And then it's very similar. You only have so much time to be able to do those things. Hopefully you thank them offline instead of that 2-second part of your talk.
Thank you.
Well, one question came up on STTR grants. It's kind of hard. It was, any unique tips on them. Those are the ones that you can be a PI as part of the institution. Potentially, I can tell you at UAB, you cannot be the grant PI for an STTR grant, even though that is allowable at the NIH. That my institution does not allow that. So you would need an external PI for that. And that's SBIR grants are sort of similar, but often use academic partners, don't have to, and the PI has to be external, meaning by external, I mean 51%. You could be the PI, but you'd have to be 51% or more external to UAB. You could no longer at my institution, or at any institution for that matter, be primarily an employee of your institution for those grants. You can for the STTR technically at some institutions. I'm just saying at mine, it's not allowed. And those are challenging too, because the PI thing, you got to deal with that. You got to deal with all the conflicts of interest. Finally, when you report it to the journal and stuff, keeping in mind that the journals are more strict often than even your institution is on some of the, at least how you handle the data. And so I always make sure to use an external statistician. And if I can, someone else is gathering the data. I'm not personally making measurements. That's kind of a good place to be too. If you're a grant writer, you probably aren't necessarily the one rattling the test tubes, but you're having someone else do those kind of things for you. And managing the project from on high and taking good feedback from them who are boots on the ground and saying, this is totally not working the way that you designed it. And then you flip it around a little bit and figure out how to get it done.
Well, thanks so much. I think we're at our hour here. Everyone was super engaged. This was really great. Awesome presentation. Andrew, really appreciate your insight and all of the tips and tricks that you've sent along. Hopefully everyone who's here goes back and watches this. I kind of get that stop, drop, and roll feeling, just stop, disclose, discuss,
Yep.
and then go on.
It's really not that hard. It doesn't necessarily have to be in the order, big picture, just disclose, and then listen to the management plan. Don't just disregard it, save them if you get one that's related to the CIRB. And then, again, if you have any more questions, feel free to reach out after this lecture, like today for the live people, or as this goes on into an enduring mode, feel free to write me. I'd be happy to answer your questions.
It's fantastic. Thank you. And thank you all for coming and attending our webinar tonight.
Thank you for the opportunity. I appreciate it.
Have a wonderful night.